Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to today's town hall on future ready learners and high impact practices. My name is Julia Michaels, if you haven't met me already, Director of Development and Strategic Partnerships for UERU, the Association for Undergraduate Education at Research University. I see lots of familiar faces emerging from the waiting room, which is great. We have a really special town hall today that's a collaboration with several of our communities of practice and with one of our partners, PebblePad. As many of you may know, URU has been partnered with PebblePad over the past year. They're one of our equity excellence champions, and we've been learning alongside them as they share their work on high impact practices, and particularly the practice of e-portfolios, which you'll hear more about. And the Centers for Teaching and Learning Leaders Community, CTLLC, which Matt co-leads, and the UR-HIP community, which just launched not too long ago. Undergraduate research and high impact practice communities are also represented here. So we're going to have a really interesting discussion today. A couple housekeeping items. So if you have something you'd like to add or questions, please feel free to raise your hand or use the chat. We can unmute you before you speak because it is just a regular Zoom meeting. There'll definitely be points where we'll pause and ask for questions and reaction from the audience. So there's a few tricks that Shane and Matt have up their sleeve to engage you. They are teaching and learning experts. I'm going to introduce my colleagues first. Shane Sutherland, who's founder and chief academic officer at PebblePad, and then Matthew Trevett-Smith, director of the Center for Teaching and Assessment of Learning at the University of Delaware. Matt, I'm going to hand it over to you to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you happen to be, or good tomorrow. My name is Matt Trevett-Smith. I'm director of the Center for Teaching and Assessment of Learning at University of Delaware, as Julia had mentioned. I think I'm also very excited and honored to be the current chair for the steering committee for the Centers for Teaching and Learning Leaders Community of Practice through URU, also as Julia mentioned. And part of today's flow, I'm going to let Shane introduce himself in just a second, but for folks in the audience, there will be a poll to get things started, so get your mouse and clickers ready, or your trackballs, or whatever you use. And also feel free to enter your questions into the chat as we go along in real time. And then Shane and I can use those as talking points for the conversation. And we've also reserved a good chunk of time towards the end to more directly answer those questions as they come through. So the primary role that I have at University of Delaware is within our Center for Teaching and Assessment of Learning. And that allows me to work very closely with faculty individually at their own courses, as well as with chairs or teams of faculty, and sometimes deans or faculty senate committees, as they're thinking about entire curricular or the entire student experience at universities. And why I'm particularly excited to chat with Shane is because he's got all that and more, right? So whereas most of my experience for the last 10 years or so has been at a single institution and conversations at exciting places like URU, Shane has an opportunity to chat with folks from multiple universities and continents on a regular basis. So I wanted to give Shane a chance. Just introduce yourself, if you would, and just give us a little bit of idea of what got you interested in this topic.
Thank you, Matt, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning, I guess, according to where you are. Hello from Cornwall at the moment in the UK. I'm always nervous when someone says you're an expert. So thank you for that, Julia. What makes you an expert, I think, is the ability, the privilege actually of traveling around the world, going to lots of universities, chatting to folks, seeing what they're doing, and then kind of passing it off almost as if it's your own. You know, you kind of gather all these ideas, and it's absolutely wonderful. But no, I try to give credit to where it belongs, but it's a real privilege having the job that I've got. Once upon a time, I was a lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton, and I inherited, and we might get a chance to talk about this later, I inherited a very large course called Learning for Success. And this course had lots and lots of theory about things like teamwork and communication and collaboration, and very little opportunity for students to practice those things. And being the course leader, I was able to rewrite it over several iterations. And it was all of that, I think, experience that led me both to helping develop PebblePad as a platform to help students think about their learning, and also made me really interested in, all of those ideas around learning to learn and being future ready, not having a curricula jam-packed with stuff, with facts and knowledge, because that changes all the time, but giving students the skills to carry on learning in a very kind of increasingly challenging and dynamic world. Did that answer the question, Matt?
And it answered the question very well. And I think what's interesting is I can't help, I was before University of Delaware, I was at Boston University while they were launching their new general education curriculum, which they affectionately called the Hub, which I love. If there's anybody from BU here, shout out to you. But I will say it's been beat into my mind because I had to say it over and over and over again when you're talking about teamwork. We talk constantly within higher education about really trying to be clear and specific about what those essential skills, knowledge, competencies, and habits of mind that we expect our graduates to be able to not only learn, but then bring forth into the world, right? And I think what's really interesting is that different educators and different institutions have different definitions of perhaps what those competencies, just to shrink everything down to one word, should be. And so this really sets up, I think, our first poll question and a discussion point for us. So we often hear terms like world readiness, work ready, career ready, and future ready across higher education. So what are these specific non-negotiable competencies that define all of these things? And so starting with, which of these terms do you use at your institution? Now, I'm not managing, so I can't see how we're doing. So I'll leave it up to our fine UERU folks to.
Well, I'll chip in if I may.
Yeah,
Matt,
go for it.
We changed this just before, sneakily, just before you arrived, to add an additional version of this question, which was, which of these terms do you, as educators, educational leaders, prefer to use? Because career ready is a clear winner there, isn't it? So, Rochelle, if we could bring up the next question. Ooh, there we go. So just wonder if there's any difference here. Which of these terms would you prefer to use? That's fascinating. You're my kind of people. Okay, and interesting that no one has plumbed for work ready. Uh, so maybe, Matt, a good time to jump into the slides themselves. Super. So thank you, Rochelle, for running the poll, saving me any worries about any technical competency required. So the story here, I guess, is one of, well, one of curricular, I think, but one that has students right at the heart of the curriculum. And I'm sure that's the way you all think about your roles and what we do at university. And what, amongst other things, what we're trying to do is to help our students to become one of those four things we just talked about. And I think that, as with so many things in higher education, and maybe actually in life in general, that the language is so important. Work ready, I think, really is a bit too utilitarian, a bit too focused on that sausage factory kind of view of education. World ready, which is obviously from the Boyer Commission and elsewhere, is a fabulous term, and I really like it. But I was in a conversation not long ago with someone who said, well, our students rarely leave the county. They certainly don't leave the state, or very few leave the state, and very few go abroad. And so world ready for us is not a term that would resonate with our students. And that was a real eye-opener for me. Career ready, I think, talks to particularly professional programs. but also it's a much broader term, I think, than work ready. But I really like future ready, and it's great to see some of you voting for that, because I think it opens up the opportunity that the kind of skills we're trying to develop are skills which help students who want to become entrepreneurs or want to carry on in their academic careers, become researchers or work in the voluntary sector or whatever else it is they choose to do. And of course, when we talk about careers as well, we each have now multiple careers, not just multiple jobs, but multiple careers in our lives. And so it's not just about preparing people for the career they go into when they graduate. It's all of those future careers as well. And not just getting a position, but also being successful in that position. So what are the skills that lead to this sense of, and I'm going to, I guess, focus on future readiness? Well, there are lots of, and I guess if we were to tie all of our aspirations together, something around the ability to thrive in a rapidly changing world. So what do those skills look like? And they look a bit like this, perhaps. These are the NACE competencies, which I know a lot of you use. And of course, also looking at them here, they look rather simplistic, they're nice little titles. But things like career and self-development encompass things around curiosity and seeking out new opportunities for development. It encompasses things like building relationships with others who can support your personal and professional development. It encompasses recognizing your strengths and areas for development and being proactive in developing yourself throughout your career. So very simple terms which belie very complex and demanding behaviors underneath them. But there's this sense that these things help make you future ready because they are, and here we go with more language, soft skills, transferable skills, graduate attributes, employability skills, durable skills, lots of ways of thinking about these collections of skills, and also lots of different versions of them. So the first bunch were NACE competencies. These are the World Economic Forum competencies or skills, again, for future readiness. Institutions have their own sets of skills, and these I really like these are from Michigan Technological University. And I like these because they're almost like calls to action. They inspire me to aspire to them. They inspire me to want to innovate and to welcome challenge. So I like the way they're framed. And of course, if you're working with professional or pre-professional programs and students, probably the discipline they belong to, the professional track they're on, has their own set of these skills as well, probably pointing more to a career. But again, who knows how long a student stays in their first career and what career they end up in. So back to these skills, they surround the student, they're things the student needs to work towards. And I think, I think I'm going to answer one of your questions early on here, Matt, from our discussion. I think one of the things we often get wrong in institutions, if I may say so, is with the benefit, this is where I can kind of pass the blame, with the benefit of talking to lots of people in lots of universities, is we put an inordinate amount of effort into thinking about these skills, getting the wording right, deciding which ones should be in and which ones shouldn't be in. And we build policies and strategies around them. And often we forget to tell the students about them, or we tell the students about them once and expect them to magically know about them and attend to them throughout their kind of learning journey with us. And I think much more attention needs to be paid to developing these frameworks of skills and making them highly visible to students and having lots of people signposting students to them and have them thinking about them.
I think that really resonates. Oh, sorry. I was going to say that really resonates with the experience that a lot of our accreditors have. I've been living in the world of middle states for the last 10 years or so, and they have something called program educational goals, which by nature of accreditation, they're requiring all programs, so any degree granting program, to have a clear set of learning objectives, or again, what they call educational goals. So what are those skills, competencies, habits of mind, et cetera, that they expect their graduates with a BA or BS or MA or MS or PhD or whatever the degree is in by the time they graduate? And I think to your point of where do they live, right? So I've worked with lots of faculty or groups of faculty from the same department, because sometimes there are multiple programs within one department, to really make it clear and explicit what those are. But to your point, what happens to those afterwards, right? They often live in an academic catalog, and perhaps at their best, they're used to map out a curriculum, but are they communicated to students? And I think that, one thing that I've really found through this process of working with faculty is that they actually provide great language for the student to communicate how they are, in fact, future ready, world ready, career ready, whatever it is, right? And I just wanted to call out a couple that are some of my favorites here to sort of seed the conversation, and hopefully some of them resonate with our audience and participation list. So for example, anthropology, which is my home discipline, one of their program educational goals is that they hope students after 4 years will be able to assess and evaluate competing explanatory and theoretical frameworks. I can see that fitting in here on this wheel, on the slide. Food science has to work collaboratively and independently, learning from diverse perspectives to assimilate knowledge and synthesize new solutions to the ways of thinking. That kind of makes me regret not having a degree in food science. Art conservation, apply the ethics of working with tangible and intangible aspects of cultural heritage. Okay, now maybe I'm back to anthropology. So the question for you is that as you're working with faculty that are that have these goals in mind, perhaps explicitly or implicitly, and whether they are or aren't communicating with the students, what does this look like? What do these experiences look like within the framework of high impact practices, maybe within or beyond an individual course?
Oh my goodness, Matt. So many kind of bits of what you've just said to pick up on. I think the one thing I'd like to say, and you sort of allude to this, is we're very, very good at really thinking deeply about what we want students to achieve and getting them into our, you call them course catalogs, for us, maybe module guides or course information, assessment briefs sometimes. Now, for me, all of that, and you talked about mapping. I think universities spend huge amounts of time mapping the curriculum, and they say, well, over here we've got a soupçon of communication, and over here we've got a little smidge of collaboration, and there's some fantastic ethical and moral decision making over here. Haven't we done a wonderful job? Well, that's of course the planned curriculum. Sometimes it's even the delivered curriculum. But how do we know whether it's the received and reflected upon curriculum that students themselves say, I can do that thing? And I think that's a real problem, that often we do a brilliant job of helping students develop these skills, but when they're asked about them, they can't speak confidently to them because we haven't helped them surface them enough. And I think also, in those examples you just gave, because I think there's also this, not tension, there's a relationship between course-specific outcomes and, in fact, program-specific outcomes, and then, if you like, generic world-ready skills. And I think sometimes students find it difficult to translate one to the other. And there's a great program we work with at the University of Edinburgh that hopefully I'll reference again later. It's called SLICS, Student-Led Individually Created Courses. But the first and most powerful piece of learning they had on that program was to take 5 generic competencies and say to students, rewrite these in the context of the piece of work you're doing. And what that led to was students really having to understand the outcomes in order to rewrite them. And the success rate on the program shot up simply because students were engaging with the outcomes and making sense of them before they undertook any work at all. Yeah. So I hope that not sure there's a full answer to what you said, but maybe the next part of the slide helps with that. Because there's something about how do we, well, the really important question, how do we develop these skills? And I think, and the ones you described, I think you can see being delivered within the context of a course or program to meet specific outcomes. But but these transferable skills, these future ready skills, which are a bit more sort of, I don't know, what's the word? Transparent, sort of, they're in the ether somewhere. Where are they happening? And they're not happening through reading about them or going on an LMS course. They're being developed through doing. And so, what are the kind of interventions where students are most often doing things? And the most obvious place to look is in high impact practices. And so here's the 11, I guess, impactful practices. But of course, that list itself is contestable. There are other things which vie to be in there. And then even if things are on that list, are they high impact? Well, they're only high impact if they have these elements or characteristics. And it's really easy to imagine. In fact, I've seen portfolio practices which are awful. They're just busy work. They happen right at the end of a program and there's no real lead up to it. First year experiences, unless there are high expectations set and they involve some element of interactions with peers and faculty and engaging with people with different experiences. It's all of those things that start to make a first year experience impactful. Just being on the list isn't impactful. So I guess, pushing a question back to you, Matt, there's a lot of stuff happening here. The common denominator, if you like, is the student. Because if the student has the opportunity to do one or more of these high impact practices, and we know, in fact, let me just speak to the Gen Ed part I've added in there, because some of these overlap and some of them are sort of almost containers for others as well. And in the Boyer Commission report, it talks about using Gen Ed as a conduit for high impact practice because it's core. It's not an option that some folks are able to take and others aren't. But I'm interested in where, in your experience, if I'm a student and I'm trying to develop these skills, and the most likely place to develop them is through one of these practices, who are the folks who are designing and delivering these experiences for me?
I love that question because oftentimes folks in my position will be working with faculty, right? Thinking about course specifics. And so, sure, maybe if there's a faculty member who's designing something like a service learning course or a community-based learning course, they might be thinking, and hopefully they would be thinking very intentionally about what that learning experience is going to be like for that student specifically within that context, or another way of saying it, what sort of learning could not happen if not for that experience within the community, for example. And in that case, the conversation for me and folks in my position is relatively easy because then it's just sound course design, right? Let's go through a backwards design process. Let's make sure your learning goals are super clear and explicit. And maybe you can start with the center role here and move out from there. And then think about things like meaningful interactions. How are you going to set up those learning experiences for the student with some intentionality, as well as frequent constructive feedback? I think that's an important component of any course that sometimes people forget about. And again, constantly reminding the student that the learning is enhanced because of this experience that you're having in this particular example within the community. But I think what's interesting is that here at UD, we have a category that we call DLE, or Discovery Learning Experience. And there's a very explicit requirement for any faculty member it's usually a course, it doesn't have to be a course, to count for DLE credit, that there has to be a really significant amount of time in the student reflecting and then being given feedback on the quality, if you will, of their reflections so that you're pointing that towards the student. The same is true for international study abroad experiences. There was a time when any study abroad experience was just sort of by the fact that they were studying abroad, oh, that must be transformational. Sure, but maybe not to the coursework that's occurring there, right? So if you want to happen with the coursework, you have to explicitly say, how you want the student to reflect on that study abroad experience within the confines of a program or course. And again, I will say, to give a shout out to BU and their hub, one of the interesting things about that is that they actually allow some of their staff to for lack of a better word, teach or give credit to students for their general education experience. And that is interesting because a lot of times, let's think about internships as a good example of this. Oftentimes, it's staff that are managing or making those connections with the students and the community. And they're not necessarily trained in how to provide frequent constructive feedback to the student or how to have high performance expectations to the student, how to help them increase opportunities to reflect. And I think that they can occur in that system, but you have to be very explicit with them as you would anybody to help facilitate that learning with the student.
Thank you. See, one of the things that befuddles me is every time I think I've got a handle on the US higher education kind of setup, I go to another UERU event and I find there's another department that looks after students in a very particular kind of part of their journey, you know, the experiential learning office and the study abroad office and the campus jobs or campus careers thing. And so, because you talked about constantly reminding, and I think that's, and it, almost if you imagine this as a shared responsibility, if these skills are well known, are visible, then everybody who works with the student can be constantly reminding or nudging or signposting the students and saying, hey, that thing we've just done looks a bit like ethical decision making, or that thing you have just done and created looks like innovation. In fact, it's collaborative innovation. So I think it's marshalling the everybody to be helping students to recognize that the things they have to do, as well as the things they do by choice through the co and extracurricular, sort of can be hung on. I always think of these as hooks, these little kind of skill hooks. The other thing that just occurred to me as you were talking was about helping people give better feedback. Well, what a wonderful future ready skill for our own students, how to request feedback, and not just how to request feedback or elicit feedback or solicit, but how to work with feedback. Because one of the things I hear in a few conversations I've been in about how students take feedback very, very personally, it can really be quite crushing. So the ability to request, accept, and work with feedback is a super powerful skill. And in fact, in the NACE competencies, it also fits in the career and self-development part.
I think we work with faculty all the time. They say giving good feedback is beyond using a green, a red, or a blue pen, right? It is actually about giving what Fink would call caring feedback, right? That is feedback that helps the student work towards learning and helping them understand. That's why you're giving them the feedback.
Yeah. And in fact, moving on in a way, there's something about questions and the power of having a broad repertoire of questions, because if students have questions to level up their own learning, they can invite others to give focused feedback using those same questions. So my next kind of, I suppose, build on this very busy slide is about which of these characteristics of high impact practices are the most important ones. And of course, there isn't one or the other that's more important. They're all important. They all have a place in different kind of contexts and different initiatives. But I really like the invest time and effort one, because I do think, I went through a period when I was teaching at university where it started to feel like we were trying to make learning too easy. And part of that, and I've got to be really careful how I talk about this. Part of that was driven often by end of course evaluations, and that made often my colleagues reluctant to innovate in the classroom. Actually, what we want is students to really invest time and effort, to see the worth, because they're investing in themselves, and to give them opportunities to reflect on it, because often they are just passive in many of these experiences. They've got to engage intellectually and emotionally. And the reason I kind of highlight both of those is because I've been talking about reflection a lot recently. And one of the problems with reflection is we often focus on looking back on an experience and not enough effort, I think, goes into planning for an experience. There's this, in fact, I read it, I've been talking a lot about noticing, and I read a great article this morning in which someone wrote that when I read complex papers, I notice what I'm noticing, and then I work with, according to what I've noticed, I decide whether to invest more energy in the thing itself. But that noticing bit is really important. So we create wonderful experiences for students, some of which are very costly to the students to engage in, not just financially, but in terms of their time. And then they find themselves in the middle of an experience thinking, what am I doing here? What was I meant to do? What's expected of me? So I think we need to invest much more time in helping them plan and prepare for learning. And for me, planning and preparing really is about having this broad repertoire of questions. What's expected of me? What does good look like? What skills will I develop as a result of this? Which skills do I take to it? Who can help me? What does good look like? What happens if that goes wrong? What happens if that goes right? And all of those questions really help a student in the moment learn more from every experience, to notice things. And if we're noticing things, then we're much better able to reflect on them because we saw things worth thinking about. And so for me, I think having this broad repertoire of questions itself is also we're helping students be future ready because those questions are themselves transferable from experience to experience. We're helping them engage with their own learning, squeeze the maximum juice out of it. And then, of course, the next stage, and you expect this from a portfolio person, is collecting and curating ready to share and showcase. Now, for me, the sharing and showcasing bit at least, is the least exciting part for me. Now, I say that, and I'm about to show you some wonderful, wonderful examples of showcase portfolios where real learning is so evident. But for me, it's the process of learning which is much more important, capturing that process and engaging in it. The collecting and curating bit, of course, is about, because the students on this journey, they'll have all sorts of different interactions and engagements and be involved in all sorts of different kinds of learning. And different things occur at different points. And often we think, oh, well, I'll remember all of that, but we don't. By collecting it together, we can start to see who I'm becoming. There's this great term, diachronicity, which is if you look back from where you are now, you can only see your former self from the lens of who you are now, unless you made notes along the way, unless you're able to say, I can't believe I used to be that anxious, or I can't believe I was that cocksure of myself. So there are these, by having these little points along the way, it really helps our students understand the journey they've been on.
I think one of the interesting things for me that this resonates and it's reminding me of, we very recently, within the last 2 or 3 weeks, had what we call here our open teaching days. Lots of universities have a couple of days or a week where different faculty or staff can sign up to visit some other class and view sort of teaching and learning occurring at their campus that they otherwise wouldn't. And I had the opportunity to sign up for 2. One was, it was very early, I think it started at 7:30, but it was the women's soccer team. And they actually opened up their morning practice. And that was one of our most popular sessions for a faculty to join in on. And the faculty, I will say, were blown away that the coach had a lesson plan for how the next 2 hours would go with the team. And it was striking to me that a lot of the concepts that are on the screen right now were on that lesson plan, right? It was important for the coach that leadership, communication, inclusion, teamwork, and critical thinking and professionalism were all on the list, not just keep your eye on the ball. In fact, her message was, the ball is just one very small fraction of what you as a professional soccer player need to be thinking about. And a lot of this idea of planning and preparing, the coach had to put a lot of time into thinking through what she wanted the goals for that particular practice to be, what the long-term goals were for that. And I'm not going to take complete credit for the soccer because we stole that from Brown. Mary Wright, I don't know if her name's on here. She did it first, as far as I know. And I think she may have stolen it from Yale Bulldog days. But the whole idea is that all of this is, in CTLs, I don't know if we ever have any original ideas. We just kind of capture and amplify the good ones. But we have the same thing. Another course that I happen to sit on was a capstone course. which itself is a high impact practice as well within general education. And that course was one of the few times where I've seen a faculty member, this usually happens in the fourth year of the student's career, bring back up, kind of dust off those program educational goals, right? So this is what we said. This is how we designed your last 3.5 years at this point. Can you speak about these? And not only that, can you solve a novel problem because of the practice and preparation that we've given you up until these last 3.5 years? But again, to kind of look at the 4 quadrants here of planning, preparing, reflecting, recording, collecting, curating, sharing, and showcasing, I think underlying all of that is an intentionality, right? And I for whoever it is that's designing that experience for the student.
Matt, if everyone could hang around for 2 hours instead of just the hour, I was talking earlier about being a former all sorts of things, didn't I? And I was a former sailing instructor and a former firefighter and firefighting instructor. And all of our learning in both of those kind of odd fields was about the experience. But we didn't just go into an experience. There was the planning and preparing. What are we expecting to see? What does good look like? What did we learn? What went wrong? What can we learn from that? And I think that engagement with it from both sides is so valuable. And that's the same if you're reading a very complex academic paper. You don't just start reading it. You think, what am I looking for here? What are the things which might challenge my thinking? What are the things I need to know going into it? So I think all learning is an experience, and we can make it a very powerful and impactful experience, or less impactful according to how much we plan and reflect back on it. And reflecting now, we're going to run out of time, so I'm going to just move on a little bit, if that's okay. Having lost my cursor, because one of the things I want to, and this is my only kind of picture of PebblePad, is because all of these things might be happening in all sorts of places, and the only constant is the student. We think it's really valuable having a tool that follows them around, where they can get used to planning and preparing, recording and reflecting, collecting and curating this stuff. And if you don't, if the tool isn't with the student, but it's with the different departments that are providing these, you get a kind of maybe a fragmented view of who you're becoming. And I feel this is a bit cheesy, really. I'm a bit embarrassed showing this slide, but I asked one of my team to come up with it, and it's I like the idea that if we get this great reflection on who we are, we get a better sense of again who we're becoming, where we're going. And listen, if you don't use PowerPoint, that's as almost all of you don't, that's fine. But I think you do need a process that follows the student around where they are encouraged to plan and prepare accordingly. You've heard that now. And I think it's really important to provide some scaffolding and for those more complex processes, in which you'd include undergraduate research and internships and study abroad and even group projects, some support across, what's the flow of this look like? And for me, really importantly, surfacing learning, helping the students see what they've accomplished. And in many cases, being able to surface that to others as well, either for the sake of giving some feedback or review, but also so those skills become apparent. They weren't just implicit. I was chatting to someone the other day, they said they're going to ban the word implicit in curriculum planning meetings because they shouldn't be implicit. They should be absolutely obvious to students what it is they're learning and gaining from every experience. And in PebblePad, we do that through templates, workbooks, portfolios, mobile, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to show you some examples if that's okay, but I do want to make sure we leave time for some questions. So this might be rather faster than I might ordinarily want. In my experience, and I learned this when I ran that big course called Learning for Success, we glibly all the time ask students to reflect on their learning. It's a very, very complex process. And if they start with a blank sheet of paper, it's very, very difficult. So let's give them a wee bit. And I know it's hard to read these things on screen. Let's give them some prompts. Let's give them some little bits of scaffolding that take them through, if you like, a process of reflect. And there are some super simple reflective models, what, so, what, now, what, or what planning looks like. You build your own ones. I quite like this one on the flight simulations, mainly because I'm jealous that I'm not on the course. Record your cockpit, take your cockpit recording, stick it here, and then think about the skills you've demonstrated and the ones you need to improve next time. And if you're up a mountain because you're a geologist or you're doing geophysics of some sort, or you're study abroad where there's Wi-Fi or mobile everywhere, but it's blooming expensive, then doing it on an app makes sense. I mentioned the MTU skills earlier, but not just having the skills and making them visible. They have this academic planning workbook. A workbook is essentially a bunch of templates kind of stuck together. But choose an ability you want to develop this semester. You kind of the students return to it time and time again and explain why that skill is so important to you right now. And talk about how you've had a challenge learning from this and identify what you learned as a result of that challenge. So you see the steps that kind of students are going through. I talked about diachronicity, didn't I? Keeping a record week by week of what you're learning. So when you're asked at the end of an internship or a placement or a project, what did you gain from this? You can read back and I've heard so many folks say, what I thought I'd learned was so different when I look back and see this, what I'd gone through. And in this age of AI, and I'm sure there'll be a question about AI, it's also a mitigation against AI coming up with AI hallucinogenic reflections. I'm being a bit, sorry, bad there, but there should be a direct line of sight between my weekly reflections and the sense that I make of it. Helping students work through projects. And this is a great example from OSU. We're going to be there in June, Steve and Julia, and hopefully a whole bunch of you folks. I can't see who you folks are because you're all invisible to me at the moment. But this one is thinking back to those characteristics, setting high expectations, making them visible, prompting reflection, and getting regular routine feedback through the prompts that students have to do as they work through these undergraduate research projects. And they don't have to be big, long research projects. Lab experiments are like research projects. And I include this one only because, oh my goodness, the amount of times I hear that engineers don't reflect or scientists don't reflect, well, absolute nonsense. They do. They might use different language for it, but always there. All of my developers, my software developers, they reflect, but they don't call it reflection. They have retrospectives and stand-ups and all of that. They have their own little, what's the word? Not regime. There's another R word that describes it. Anyway, I'll lose time trying to remember it. And moving on to portfolios. Portfolios, thing about high impact practices can be those intensive writing experiences. This one is a wonderful example of a multiple page portfolio written by the fabulous Susan Bonham. And the audience for this starts off being Susan trying to make sense of this experience in a kayak doing paddles and pedagogy. And she's making sense and organizing it so there's a second bite at the learning cherry, so to speak. And it's a portfolio of learning, but it also becomes a portfolio for learning because she shared it with numerous colleagues who get to experience the same thing vicariously by reading through all the lessons here. And I think that's a lovely example. Portfolios are sketchbooks that demonstrate the route taken to an idea or innovation. And this is my concluding bit to make sure we've got time for questions. Some wonderful examples shared with me from OSU where they've got this really well-developed Gen Ed offer for their students. And they have a launch seminar and they have a bookend seminar. And these examples, I'm going to have to lean in to kind of read this. But Charlie developed a passion for financial education and taking his skills to rural communities to help them with their financial learning. And he talks about how this portfolio is mainly for my peers and any non-profit organization involved in financial literacy. This one and I apologize if I get the names wrong. I did try to work out how to pronounce all of these properly. Dure. And in her portfolio, she says, my hope is that the portfolio will primarily serve as a reflection tool for myself, sense-making thing, looking back across those 4 years of her journey through OSU. Zoe is a applied mathematician, but also with a minor in horticulture, and her aspiration is to use mathematical models to help develop sustainability kind of initiatives. And her portfolio is to help other other peers pursue similar academic kind of routes. And finally, that's my final but one slide. And this is Sunija, who has a history in farming and is taking that family farming tradition and using her interest, her academic interest in geosciences to really think about climate impacts on farming. And the final example on this particular slide from Gabriella, she talks about this portfolio being for herself, for her peers, but also written as a means of applying to the optometry program at OSU. So serving multiple purposes. The reason we've got Gabriella's on here is because, as I mentioned, the Gen Ed program has a launch seminar and a bookends reflection seminar. And what Gabriella has done, and in fact all the students do, is look back on their original goals. And she talks about how her interests and goals have changed during her time at OSU. And so that sense making is such an important part of this and making it visible. If the students hadn't spent time right at the beginning of their program thinking about what they wanted to achieve and what their goals were, that reflection at the end, that sort of capstone piece, is much, much less, I think, both valid, authentic, and valuable. So just to conclude, Matt, what we're sort of saying is student at the center of the curriculum, bunch of skills, no matter what kind, which framework you use, make them visible to the students, make them visible and give them the means through all of the various interactions that they're involved in to really engage with those learning experiences through planning thoughtfully for them, reflecting well on them and collecting bits of evidence over time. So that's my story. It's now time, I guess, to close out the slides, all get together around tea, coffee, strong whiskey.
Too early for that around here, I suppose. Although maybe not. So if anybody is, Julie, I do want to recognize your question. I want to give also a chance if anybody wants to pop on camera or on mic and ask a question. We're very informal here, so feel free to do that. I can speak on behalf of Steve, right? We're informal, so if you have a question, just feel free to pop on.
I've not obviously been able to follow the chat, so I'm not sure if many questions have been popping in there.
I'll reframe Julia's and perhaps people are thinking about their own question. So Julia is thinking about the longevity of these portfolios past graduation. I think a lot of that is interesting. I'm also curious to kind of grow on that a little bit and say, one of the weaknesses is that oftentimes these things exist just within one course and then students forget about them, right? So I assume there's a benefit to having these resources live beyond a single course, beyond a single semester, a year, or as Julia's question is framing, what happens even after graduation, perhaps?
Well, I think the important thing, and it's an odd thing to say, is the portfolios, I can't say, they're often a bit flippant. I was going to say they don't matter. It's in the writing of the portfolio. It's in the gathering of the evidence, the thinking about my learning, about the journey I've been on. That I think that's where the really importance lies. I think I hear stories all the time about people who got positions because employers saw their portfolio. But actually, I think it's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of folks where actually their portfolio was seen by an employer. The really important thing, I think, is the thinking, the processes that are going on, the ongoing planning and the reflecting piece. But what's really important, and I think this is where we have to think about portfolios not being part of, as you say, Matt, a single course or a thing that happens right at the end. It becomes, you have many, I think of portfolios as being stories, and we each have many, many stories, some of which define a very small part of our life, some which gather lots of other stories together, and some which, are our whole life story. And you have different stories for different purposes. And I think that's the same with portfolios. Nevertheless, the technology allows your portfolio to go with you, allows you to carry on using all of the tools, certainly in our case. But from a pedagogical point of view, what's the point of this? Well, the point of this is to help students make sense of those experiences, to surface what they're learning, and to develop the habits of being able to speak to the special skills that they have developed and what's unique about them.
That's helpful. And I think Tony's question builds off of this a little bit, as well as, so who controls access to the different aspects of the materials, reflections, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the student, the institution, so who controls those?
Well, from a PebblePad point of view, and other tools are available, as is often said. The portfolio is a bit like, I mean, I'm not sure if I can pull this up and make the camera work. So on my laptop, let's get in focus. I've got all sorts of things. I've got RFPs, I've got appraisal documents, I've got wedding photos, I've got videos from my holidays. The only person they all make sense to is me, and they're on my laptop. It's the same with PebblePad. The careers team could say, hey, go and find a job that you'd really like to do, and take the list of skills that they're asking for in that job and reflect on how you will develop those skills in order to get the job you want. And by the way, use PebblePad. And the only person or people that interaction with the platform makes sense to is the student themselves and the careers team. Meanwhile, I'm studying anthropology. I would love to do that, Matt. And you say to me, listen, every class, I want you to do a little 50-word reflection on the highlight moments of the class. And at the end of the class, I'm going to ask you to share 3 of those with me as a little sort of hurdle assessment, let's say. Well, the only person that makes sense to is you as my course teacher and me. But those things for me start to build. The more people that ask me to do some level of planning or reflecting or aggregating, the more powerfully, or the more I'm getting out of all of those combination of experiences. So the platform is just a platform. It sits there in the institution. I'm not sure if anyone is here from OSU that could speak to that. It sits there, and you can use it for campus careers. You use it for gen ed. You can use it for study abroad. Students in honours and scholars are using it for their undergraduate research projects. It doesn't matter how many times it's used. In fact, it does matter, because the more times it's used, the more power the individual student is getting from it.
I wanted to elaborate on that question just a little bit to give maybe a clear answer. So that what's placed into the system, is it exportable for the student afterward? I think that gets to a little bit to the sense of ownership.
Yeah, so all of the files that go in there. And so traditionally with a portfolio, you would upload a PowerPoint and a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet or a video as evidence of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
In PebblePad, the templates and workbooks allow you to learn in the tool, because it's got that scaffolding to help you do the planning and reflecting and connecting. Now, all of those are printable as PDFs, etc. But because there's not another tool that has templates and workbooks in the way that PebblePad has templates and workbooks, they're not exportable in a kind of digital, I mean, other than as PDF, which is obviously the most commonly used archive file. So we give you PebblePad for free when you graduate. And in a way, I don't want this to become just a PebblePad promotional thing here, but it's really important to us that not just your stuff, not just the files and reflections, but the tool itself remains available to you for your early career development. And oh my goodness, in fact, no, since we've been doing this, the amount of students that call us 6 months or 9 months after they've left university and say, I told the university I didn't want my PebblePad account, and now I want to get access to it again. Can you turn it back on for me? So, sometimes there's a kind of, students don't realize quite how valuable it is until a little way down the line. But we keep it available for students well after graduation.
I'm curious if a lightning response, because I want to give Steve and Julia time at the end here to preview some of the upcoming events. So a lightning answer, but a question for you. A little bit of framework. This reminds me of a question about a decade ago. I worked with some colleagues at Virginia Commonwealth University that were trying to launch an open university initiative, which allowed a lot of the student artifacts to exist in the open internet. And I think this question is getting at this. So instead of a standalone e-portfolio or something like LinkedIn or something like WordPress or any other blogging platform, I know you said you don't want to talk too much about PebblePad specifically, but sort of why why PebblePad in this instance? I'm going to force you to give a lightning response if you could before turning things back over to our hosts.
Well, listen, if I was going to write a professional portfolio, I would probably use WordPress. If I was going to write a professional web page about me or my business, if I want to connect with people around the world, I'm probably going to use LinkedIn. PebblePad is a pedagogically designed tool. It's designed to help students. Back to that thing, isn't it? Plan and prepare for learning, record and reflect it, collect and curate, share and showcase with very, very robust privacy, no ads, your data being absolutely secure, and the ability for someone like you, Matt, honestly, with about 5 minutes training, to turn out a reflective template for your students at the end of every session that helps them engage with their learning, gives you reports, allows you to check their progress. So it's a tool built to help learners make the most of their learning. It's not just the portfolio bit that says, hey world, look at who I am, because there are other tools that will do that equally well.
I love that answer. I think it brings to home that the students in the center, but they're sharing that space with learning that's happening, right? It's sort of it's not only the person, but it's the learning that is there. So thank you for that answer.
Absolutely.
Steve and Julia, thank you for this time. Did you want to say anything to close us out?
Yeah, real quick. Thank you both, Shane and Matt, for this really delightful conversation. I found it very interesting and valuable. If you're in the CTLLC community and you're interested in UR-HIP or vice versa, we're putting the communities in the chat. Feel free to reach out if you're interested in becoming more involved in those community spaces. Also share that at our upcoming UVP meeting in Columbus, Ohio at Ohio State, PebblePad will be represented there as well at one of the panels. If you want to see a real live example of how this is happening in action at a university like Ohio State. I'm sorry, the Ohio State University. And then lastly, of course, I will turn it over to Steve to talk about a couple other things. Steve?
Oh, well, I just glad to have the opportunity to thank Shane for presenting on PebblePad and for all their support over the past year. And thanks to you, Matt, and everything you're doing to lead the Center for Teaching Learning Leaders community. We put in the chat a few publications, including one of Matt's, and I direct your attention to it. We just thank you all for taking time from your day to think about our students and their learning process and what we can do to help improve that for them. So central, in fact, indeed, the most central thing that we do as educators, of course. So thanks to all. Thank you, Julia, for hosting. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.